Hello and welcome to NH1.com. My name is Kimberley Haas. I'm joined today by Roger Stephenson. He is with the Union of Concerned Scientists. He is one of their outreach coordinators. How are you today?
Thank you for having me, Kimberley. Terrific.
Now, Roger, maybe we could start by having you tell the audience at home a little bit about your background.
Sure. I'm a UNH graduate, class of '79, and with the exception of 6 or 7 years in Washington, my family and I have been in the seacoast area for about 35 years. My degrees are in zoology and wildlife biology, but I got into the public relations practice through my work in Washington and with several groups in the past.
So how did you become interested particularly in climate change?
Mm-hmm. My initial interest in climate change was how it was impacting wildlife and the natural systems. But as I worked in the public relations field, I was introduced to clients who were working on the issue of carbon and carbon pollution from a private sector standpoint and from a municipal standpoint. So my interest in climate change now spans a variety of sectors: public health, municipal, the private sector, and wildlife.
Why do you think it's so important for people to know what's happening with the climate, particularly on our seacoast here in New Hampshire?
Mm-hmm. Well, no one is disputing the trends with respect to the increased frequency of severe storms. Someone remarked to me after Hurricane Sandy that we really dodged the bullet. Municipalities are waking up to the fact that they have to deal with more frequent storms, more frequent storm surges, increased incidents of flooding. What used to be occasional nuisance flooding is becoming recurrent and costly.
What municipalities are the most hard hit when we're talking about this trend?
Well, right now we've got a number of communities from Seabrook to Portsmouth working with the Rockingham Planning Commission and other experts to assess their vulnerability to coastal storm surge and sea level rise. Each municipality, Seabrook, Hampton, Northampton, Hampton Falls, Rye, Portsmouth, and Newcastle, are working to assess their vulnerabilities individually, working with officials and expert planners.
Are many of these vulnerabilities the same? Are the leaders in Seabrook, for example, saying the same things as the leaders in Portsmouth are?
Well, interesting that you say that, because Seabrook is a beach habitat, and in fact if you look at it closely, it really is a barrier beach. Portsmouth has more of a rocky shore, so that there are different things that the different communities have to take into account. But every community is looking at their public assets, where their emergency facilities are, the important roads for evacuation. They're looking at where their sewer pump stations are. They're looking at their water supplies, and they're looking at their telecommunications and electric infrastructure, as are many of the utilities.
Fascinating. Let's move over to our storyteller so you can explain some of the science and show us some of the graphs that prove that there has been a rise in the sea level, not only here locally, but globally. Mm-hmm. So this chart right here shows us global sea level from 1860 to 2010. Roger, maybe you can tell us what this means for the world and then how that relates to the trends we're seeing locally.
Sure. First of all, this chart is part of the National Climate Assessment that came out. That is the U.S. report that comes out every 5 years on climate change here in the United States. And what we see here is the trends are not in dispute. That sea level rise, a global mean sea level, has increased over the last 150 years. What we have here is also a chart that is part of the National Climate Assessment. It's also part of the report that the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazards Commission accepted from a scientific panel last year in July. We have here sea level coming up through 2000, and we have different scenarios now between lowest sea level rise and highest. Sea level rise is a function of thermal expansion of the oceans. They are warming. There's no dispute there. And as anything warms, it expands. So we have thermal expansion of the ocean. We also have the melting of land-based glaciers and the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. All of those are contributing to about 90% of the sea level rise we're seeing. Now,
and these are predicted numbers, right, Roger? So that's from 1992 to 2100. So that's looking out way further than where we are now. And it can go a variety of different directions, it looks like.
And it's difficult to predict what the greenhouse gas emissions will be in the future. But we do know, research does show us, that the current concentrations of greenhouse gases plus suspected additional emissions in the future will contribute to sea level rise. That's in part why we have this wide range of scenarios here. In New Hampshire, we can show here what we've seen at Seavey Island, which is off of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. We've seen an increase in sea level rise, about half a foot since 1926. That represents about almost 3/4 of an inch per decade. But now, since 1993, we've seen an acceleration of that to about 1.7 inches of sea level rise per decade. And you can see Portsmouth Shipyard, Boston, Massachusetts, Portland, Maine, they're all exhibiting the same trends. And if we go back to this slide, what this means here in New Hampshire in 2050, we could see sea level rise on the coast of New Hampshire from anywhere from a half a foot to approximately 3 feet. And in 2100, we would see between 1.5 feet and almost 6.5 feet of sea level rise.
So what does that mean? I mean, an inch doesn't sound like a lot to the layperson like myself, but what does that mean scientifically? Well,
what it means, let's talk about what it means for people. The New Hampshire coastal communities are hundreds of years old. I live in Stratham. We're celebrating our 300th anniversary. Hampton is much older, Portsmouth's older. These political subdivisions were designed to last, and arguably the buildings, the public assets need to last as well. So if we're talking about municipalities that are hundreds of years old, how will municipalities need to adapt to a changing environment, which means more inundation, which means more chances for saltwater intrusion into well water, which means more exposure to the buildings and the property that exists on the coast.
So then it's really no surprise that everybody is talking, especially where we are right now, and there's so many different possibilities and ways that we could go, that this is on the forefront of everybody's mind on the seacoast right now.
That's right. There's the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Work Group, of which the Union of Concerned Scientists is a member. It includes state agencies, some federal representation, the Rockingham Planning Commission, the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. We've been working as a coalition to help municipalities understand the issue, what it means to them, and what they can do about it.
Roger, maybe we could transition now and talk a little bit about the economics behind what all of this means when we're talking about climate change.
Sure. From a standpoint, simply economically, looking at the seacoast is home to 1/4 of New Hampshire's workforce. A lot of people work there, a lot of people live there and commute elsewhere. That's something to take into consideration. To support 1/4 of New Hampshire's workforce, you need infrastructure that's reliable. You need the roads, the bridges, and the lights and the internet working. The other thing to take into account is there's $60 billion worth of property value insured in the coastal counties. And that means that insurance companies and the reinsurance companies are taking a very close look at their exposure. And some people are finding that underwriting flood insurance is becoming prohibitive.
So where can people find out more information if they're interested in this topic?
Well, I think people can go to the Union of Concerned Scientists website, ucsusa.org. But the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services holds the New Hampshire Climate and Energy Action Plan. The New Hampshire Climate and Action Plan is the product of one of the largest, most diverse group of stakeholders I've seen assembled in years. And the Climate and Energy Action Plan has a series of 67 recommendations. Municipalities are taking up many of those recommendations, and so are some in the private sector. People can find that at the Environmental Services website.
Great. Thank you so much for your
Sure.
time today, Roger.
Thank you.
And thank you at home for watching NH1.com. From the studio, this is Kimberley Haas.